Hello, everyone. I'm the guy that stands between you and lunch. So I'm guessing that you're all forming emotional profiles that are not really favorable to me, but one more reason to get going. I feel very honored to be here, and actually dawned upon me how much of an honor it is only in the last yesterday and today, hearing all these wonderful speakers. I might be the only person in the room to be glad that Andrew Meltzoff has left for two reasons. I mean, first, it certainly would have made me very nervous to be talking in front of such a champion of psychology. And the second thing is, it would have been irresistible to stick my tongue out at him. Okay. So, I'm going to talk to you about the research that we did on roots of empathy in Switzerland. And you see the title of my talk, which is a quote that I came across when I had conversations about roots of empathy during this work. People often, when I told them about roots of empathy and gave a description of the programs, that their reaction often was, wow, that seems like a very nice idea, and the babies sure are cute, but is there any evidence that this really does change something in children's behavior and in their empathy? So that's what we tried to find out in our study in Switzerland, and I'll try to give you a description of our most important findings during the next 40 to 45 minutes. This is a picture of where I come from, where I bring the news from. This is the city of Zurich. This is also the city where most of these Roots of Empathy classrooms in Switzerland took place. And I want to take the time to set the record straight on one thing. Christian yesterday had a talk in which he mentioned this very interesting study of Tanya Singer and others, if you remember, where they showed that whether you experience empathy while witnessing somebody else experiencing pain depends on whether that other person is a supporter of the same football team that you're a supporter of, or whether he isn't. And while I had known this study, and I was, of course, when I heard it first, I was shocked, as perhaps many of you were, because we certainly think, or should think, that it's important to surpass this in-group, out-group boundary, right? That seems to be that a lot of empathy seems to be subject to. In this particular case, however, I empathize completely with the fans of one of these football clubs who did not feel empathy when seeing how the fans of the other club were in pain, because one of these clubs really is very good and the other club is. I'm a supporter of one of the teams. Okay, but on a more serious note, what am I going to talk about? Three things, actually, three questions that I'm trying to answer in the next 40 minutes. I want to answer the question, or at least show you the evidence on the question of whether roots of empathy in Switzerland did work, where it did work, and this is not meant spatially, geographically, but what are the outcome domains where we did see effects, and were there others perhaps where we didn't see any? And I'm also going to talk briefly on how it did work. Although this is kind of an overstatement, you will see this is more like a pretty general approach to what elements or components of the program work, but I still think it's interesting. It might be also indicative of future developments in the Roots of Empathy program. Okay, so this is a picture of an actual photo of Roots of Empathy that was carried out in Switzerland. What's striking, I think, is how little difference you'll probably notice to how the Roots of Empathy program is carried out. We visited a classroom the day before yesterday, and what struck me was that you really, if there had been no sound, you wouldn't have been able to tell whether this is in Canada or in Switzerland. The children, they really respond and react in exactly the same way. It was pretty impressive to me. The Roots of Empathy program came to Switzerland in the year of 2014, and we started our study in the year of 2015. A few more things to say about this study. We covered two cohorts, the cohort that began in school year 2015 to 2016, and the second cohort in year 2016 to 2017. We had a follow-up measurement on the first of these cohorts, so that we were also looking at were there any effects that lasted beyond the completion of the program, because this is a big issue, of course, as you all know, in prevention and intervention research. Our study was funded by the Swiss Child Protection Fund, which is a private, public-private partnership. The UBS Optimus Foundation, UBS as in the bank, was involved, and also a Swiss federal ministry and another foundation, the Oak Foundation. And one of the very pleasant and enjoyable things for us as the research team was that we really did not feel that we were in any way influenced either by the fund or by Roots of Empathy. And this is a bit different from other experiences that we've had working with organizations that mandated us to evaluate programs. The design of the study, I'm not going to go into the details, especially not at this hour we have before lunch, but we did a matched control trial, so it's not a randomized controlled trial for reasons that I'll explain shortly, and it was pre-test, post-test, so we tried to really consider or assess whether there had been change during the time that Roots of Empathy was carried out and beyond, and whether this was attributable to the program itself. It was also kind of a mixed methods approach, so we had quantitative measures, we had measurements, but we also had a qualitative part to it. We did focus groups and interviews. That was really fun to do with the children, the instructors and the teachers. The children group were fun, but I'm not going to really go into that for reasons of time. Okay, so here you have a brief an overview of the study design. What you see is we had 2 cohorts. See that? We had 4 classrooms in the ROE group and 4 in the control group in the first cohort, and 9 and 6 in the second group. The important part here was to do a matching that would really deserve that description. It was important to match controls in a way that would really allow us to draw conclusions, and that was a difficult process, and we invested a lot of time in it, but we're quite happy with the results. Now, before I come to the results and talk to you about what we found, I would like to say a few things about the measures or the constructs that we used. And I know that you've been exposed in the last today and yesterday to a lot of definitions of empathy. And I don't know if you have that saying in English. In German, we have the saying, ask 3 lawyers and you get 5 opinions. You probably have that, right? Lawyers are the same, just like children in classrooms in Roots of Empathy all around the world. But you could say, I think, ask 3 empathy researchers and you get 10 definitions. The reason why I want to explain to you what we understood as empathy is because it's important to understand the findings and the distinctions between different facets of empathy as they showed up in our study. One very influential approach to defining empathy comes from Daniel Batson, and he, I think, distinguished between 8 different facets of empathy. I'm just showing this to you so you will be more kind in your heart towards the less complicated distinction that I'm using. So you could say that it is possible to even distinguish more fine-grainedly, but I think it's useful to do it in a way that has been proposed during this conference, but my title is a little bit different. The first thing that Christian talked about a lot is emotional contagion. And probably by now you know what this is. This means that you come to feel the same feeling that another person is feeling without necessarily being aware that it is the other person's feeling. I'm pretty nervous right now. If you're feeling nervous, but you're not really feeling nervous for me, or you're feeling my nervousness, but you're feeling nervous yourself, that would be emotional contagion. Now, effective empathy, and this is important for our study, effective empathy in the way we understand it, is the ability to get a feeling for another person's feeling. You kind of feel what that other person is or might be feeling, but you never confuse the two. But still, it's an effective sensation. It's not an intellectual appreciation or knowledge of what the other person might be feeling. You kind of sense it, and I think Christian also talked about this definition of empathy a lot. And then there's cognitive empathy, and this is really the intellectual approach towards other people's emotions. So while you may feel a little bit that I'm nervous right now, it could also be that you're not feeling anything with regard to that. But if you were asked tonight, was he nervous, you would get to think and you would, kind of intellectualize on the topic. And yeah, he was standing in front of a large audience, and his gestures were kind of, fidgety. So yeah, probably he was nervous. So that would be an intellectual appreciation or an intellectual assessment. And then, very importantly, there's something else again, which is sometimes called empathic concern, sometimes it's called compassion, sometimes sympathy. I think Brian Goldman used sympathy in a very different way yesterday, but in the literature you often encounter this definition where sympathy or empathic concern mean you care for another person. You don't necessarily have to feel what that other person feels when that person is, for example, sad. You don't necessarily have to be sad, but you have to be concerned. So that's the fourth definition. And then in our study, this is not actually a facet of empathy, but it's something that also comes up a lot in empathy research, emotion recognition. And you could say that all these other facets of empathy, which are not, of course, mutually exclusive, you could even say that they might be dependent on each other, which is a research topic, that they're put to use in the task of recognizing another person's emotion. And that's something we measured in our study, that's why I'm mentioning it. Okay, to speed up a little bit, we also had, and this is an important part of our study, we also looked into prosocial behavior. Did roots of empathy actually promote children's tendency to behave prosocially? Now, what does prosocial behavior mean? I sometimes come across misunderstandings. Prosocial behavior is any behavior that is intended to help another person. It has to be intended. If it accidentally helps another person, it wouldn't be, in my definition at least, and a definition I think is helpful, prosocial behavior. Prosocial behavior needs to be distinguished from altruism. And altruism is prosocial behavior that comes at a cost to oneself. And we looked at both dimensions, and we think it's very interesting actually to distinguish between them. Prosocial behavior, if you have 5 cookies on your table, and you're actually a bit hungry, but you can't have more than 2 right now, and you give a third or even the 4th and the 5th cookie to somebody else, that would be prosocial behavior. If there was only 1 cookie on the table and you were really hungry, and somebody came up to you and said, could I have half of it, and you would give it to that person, that would be altruistic behavior, because now it comes really at the cost to yourself. Okay. And finally, aggression. And the way we measured aggression or aggressive behavior was in 2 broad domains. One was physical aggression. I think I don't have to explain that term. And the other was relational aggression. Most of you will probably have heard about relational aggression. That's kind of aggressive behavior that's directed not physically at another person, but it's intended to damage the relationship or the social status that people have. For example, by excluding a person, by talking, by bad-mouthing a person, by talking badly about a person, thus damaging their reputation. So we looked at both these dimensions of aggression. When I said we looked at them, I'm talking about different kinds of measurements. We included self-reports, asked children to assess their own behavior and thoughts and feelings. We used teacher reports. We used peer nominations, which was interesting. We asked children how, for example, empathic is a certain other child. Of course, we didn't use the word empathic, but we asked questions that cover the construct of empathy. And in some domains, like emotional recognition and altruism, we also use behavioral measures. And I'm going to show you one of them right now. Okay. That was one of the videos that we showed the children. We showed them 15 of them. And I actually wanted to ask you what emotion that boy was showing, but right, I have been given away because of the technical details. of this presentation, but I think you could easily recognize the boy's emotion right from his face. There's a lot of debate whether this is a sensible and good way to actually assess emotion recognition, but we did, and we had some interesting findings. Okay. Now, I'm not going to dive into this, but this is just a characterization of the sample that we had. It's supposed also to show you that we were fairly successful, or actually quite successful, in matching the two groups to each other, so that in terms of socio-demographic information, the two groups, ROE group and the control groups, were really equivalent. And we also, of course, looked at the baseline levels, how prosocially were they at the beginning of the program in the two groups, how empathic were they, how aggressive were they, and we didn't find differences that we could not cover by statistical means, the statistical means that we employed in our study. Okay, so the results. What are the results? Of course, I'm going to paint also in some areas, I will give you a more detailed and nuanced presentation of the results, but in very broad terms, this is what we got. And what you see here are unstandardized regression coefficients and effect sizes. I don't know how familiar you are with these. Some of you will certainly be, others won't. But I think the important part is in that second column from the right, effect sizes. What you see there is the extent of the difference that we found between the two groups. And what you see is that we did find a lot of effects. So roots of empathy, a bit to our surprise, to be honest, was effective in many of the domains that we looked at. It had the largest effect size in the area of empathy, which shouldn't come as a surprise, at least to you. But it showed here how important it is to distinguish between different facets of empathy, because we actually just found effects for effective empathy, the phenomenon I talked to you, and we didn't find any for cognitive empathy or for emotional contagion or for emotion recognition. Now, the side that there is a convention in the literature that such an effect would be considered a small to moderate effect, which is actually a pretty huge effect for a prevention program. You don't often find effect sizes in this range, but this convention is not really useful. I think it's more important somehow to compare how different programs are faring in different avenues. Okay. What you also see is that aggression was reduced. Both physical aggression and relational aggression. You also see that prosocial behavior increased, altruism increased in the one test that we had on it. And you see a couple of other dimensions. We measured a lot of other things that I haven't mentioned so far, and some important things are emotion regulation. You will see why it is important in our opinion, which was also increased. There was no increase of self-esteem, interestingly. But there was a decrease in emotional internalizing problems and externalizing problems, meaning that like emotional problems, tendencies to feel depressed or anxious, and also outward behavior like antisocial behavior or ADHD tendencies, they were all reduced. So that was interesting because it's not something that is addressed explicitly, I think, also or directly by the Roots of Empathy program. Okay, one important information is, of course, did it last, or did these effects hold after 1 year after the completion of the program? I've simplified things. I didn't want to throw another complicated table at you, but what you see here is that the effect size not only held up, but they actually even increased a little bit. And that was now quite a big surprise for us, to be honest, because you quite often find positive results at the end of a certain program, right at the end, but if you go back a year after or 2 years after, of course we didn't do that, that would be another question, but a year after, a lot of it has vanished quite often. It didn't, that was not the case here in this study. Okay, then I want to kind of qualify for whom does Roots of Empathy work. I don't know how sympathetic to that question Roots of Empathy is. Because the way I perceive the literature, it's always kind of thought of as a program that really addresses everyone. But this doesn't stop researchers from looking at questions like that. And we wanted to know, were there any differences? And one very broad categorical difference that has often come up during this conference is gender. So was there a gender difference in roots of empathy? Interestingly, but not surprisingly, in both groups, girls had more positive development, both in the control group and in the ROE group. They grew over the course of a year, they grew more empathic, less aggressive, more prosocial than the boys did. And you find that in a lot of longitudinal studies without any intervention, so it's not that big of a surprise. What we also did find was a slight interaction, meaning that in the domains of empathy and aggression, girls actually profited a little bit more than boys did. Whether this is transfers to other studies or to other populations, other countries, is of course something that I can't answer from the data, but it was interesting to see this tendency. And then we also, I think this is a very relevant question, we also looked at does the effect or the outcome of roots of empathy depend on what level that the children start out? So, for example, are those with very little empathy those that profit the most, that make the most progress, or is it that those who already have a lot of empathy at the beginning of the program make the most progress? Because that's something you also quite often find in prevention and intervention studies. We had no significant interaction. We did have a slight tendency towards more market effects in the medium range, not those starting out with very low or very high levels, but in the medium range, but it was not statistically significant. So you could say, from the best of our knowledge, based on this study, really all groups of children in this case do show some progress in roots of empathy. Okay, so to sum up, the first question, did roots of empathy in Switzerland work? I've already said that this is a small effect, small to moderate effect in statistical terms, according to a convention. Now I'm kind of leaving, the impartiality of a researcher when I'm saying it's kind of huge to have a small detectable effect in a program like this. We were skeptical because it's so short term and 9 visits to a classroom, short interactions, and so on. So we were actually surprised to find a small detectable significant difference. I've already said perhaps the effects might be a little stronger for girls and for those in the medium range. Now, very interesting in my opinion, is that we found that effective empathy was promoted, but cognitive empathy was not. And this is perhaps something, if you have the patience before lunch, that we might discuss over. One of the conclusions that we are drawing is that it might actually be that roots of empathy did not so much promote children's ability to empathize, but their propensity. And this, I think, ties with what you, Christian, said yesterday, that it wasn't so much that they got better at emotion recognition, for example. They didn't get better, but they were more motivated to use the emotion recognition capabilities that they already had and put them to use in both empathizing with others and helping and sharing with them. Okay. Now, I want to take the time also to kind of pay tribute to a recent trend in the empathy literature, which I actually find is quite intriguing, and it can even be liberating in ways. There has been a counter-movement. I don't know if you've realized counter-movement is a big term. There's one book out by psychologist Paul Bloom, but there are a couple of other authors, I think, that think in a similar direction. He wrote a book against empathy. And we looked at, without knowing Paul Bloom's book, it hadn't been published, we looked in one dimension because we had a similar suspicion, to test whether there was actually a downside of empathy and roots of empathy. I brought a couple of quotes that are perfectly in line with the Song of Praise of Empathy. That is, for example, Barack Obama here. I'm not going to read it because of the time. Actually, the interesting thing is, this is the 44th president, right, of the United States, and I tried very hard to find a similar quote promoting empathy in the 45th president. Actually, about 2 hours. I did not succeed. Okay. There's Carl Rogers talking about empathy and saying how important it is, and there's, of course, a woman called Mary Gordon, who's obviously well known here in Canada, who said empathy is the best peace pill that we have. And you find a lot of these quotes. But here comes Paul Bloom with his book Against Empathy, and he makes basically 4 arguments against empathy, why it can, in certain circumstances, he's not all against it, be risky. And I'm not going to go into the details of these, but just outline it. I will just outline them very, very quickly. One thing he says is empathy is a limited resource. You can't empathize with everyone. I'm very well aware of this right now, though I feel maybe kind of bad for you that you can't have lunch right now. I can't really feel your pain. All you people in the room, that because my empathic capabilities, like everyone else's, are not that big. They're just a limited resource. Connected to this is the fact that empathy is partial. As soon as I start empathizing with you, I'm like kind of shining the light of empathy on you. Spotlight, I'm not empathizing with other people, so that might lead to partiality. And also, therefore, empathy may be abused. Paul Bloom has an interesting example of how the Democrats in the US evoke the empathy of their voters when they make an argument for being very kind and inclusive with regard to immigrants, because they point to the suffering of immigrants. And the Republicans evoke the empathy of their voters by pointing to the suffering of the victim of criminals who are immigrants. So both parties, it's not just one party, but both parties really point to empathy and use empathy and kind of strategically abuse empathy. And then another argument is that it may overwhelm and paralyze. I think we've heard something about this with Brian's talk yesterday. If you somehow can't protect yourself from feeling too much of the pain of another person, it might actually paralyze you or even motivate you to do something bad to that person just so that you won't be exposed to the other person's suffering. Okay, the one area we looked at was this partiality thing. And for that we employed a test or a game that's called the trust game. Many of you will know this. It's from behavioral economics. And I'll just quickly explain to you how this game is played. We explained it to children, of course, in the study. Every child in this game gets at first 10 coins, and these were actually transferred into real money, so it was about real money, this game, and can now take a decision. The child can decide to evenly distribute these 10 coins among him or herself and another child from the same class. And then the game will be over. The child will exactly know, I will get 5 coins, the other child will get 5 coins, and the game is over. He or she can take an alternative decision. He can say, I will hand the decision over to another child. The other child can decide how many coins he or she will take and give back to me. That's the important part. And in this case, and I think that's where it gets interesting, the money is doubled, so that the other child then has 20 coins to decide on how many they will keep or give back to the child that took the decision in the first round. And that other child can decide between an even split, 10 and 10, so that the child that made the decision to move the decision over to the other child is better off, or an unfair choice, to keep 17 for him or herself and give 3 back. Okay, so that's the game. And the first round is very interesting. It's about trust. The second round is about altruism, and that's what I'm going to focus on and show you the results of in our Roots of Empathy study. As I already said, we found a significant effect in terms of altruism in this game of Roots of Empathy, meaning that the Roots of Empathy children behaved more altruistically on average. But interestingly, the difference came wholly from when they played this game with children from their own class, because we had 2 conditions, one in which they played it with children from their own class, and one with children, an anonymous child from another class. And here's the difference, and you see it, I think, in these graphs. Roots of Empathy children kind of preferred, in this regard, the children from their own class to the children from another class. You could reason, it's not safe-proof, but you could reason this is because they were more empathic towards the other children. But they also introduced a difference between how they treated their own and they treated others. And I think you can look at this from two ways. You can say they're behaving more altruistically altogether, so this is progress. And you can say they behave less impartially. In this case, this would be kind of a bad or downside. And a very interesting topic also to talk about or to speculate what it exactly means, but I think we have to defer this to the discussion. Okay, then how does the roots of empathy work? This is, of course, very interesting. I think for us as researchers, showing whether something has an effect or hasn't is interesting too, but it really gets intriguing when you look at the mechanism, the causal pathways. And I just want to show you the results we have on prosocial behavior and aggression. This is the total effect that the Roots of Empathy program has on prosocial behavior. The numbers do not need to concern us. They're unstandardized coefficients. They mean nothing practically. They just mean that there is a significant impact of the program. Now, we were interested in, was this change mediated through empathy? Was it really the change in empathy, the increase of empathy that led to this increase of prosocial behavior, as I think the program would assume there is? And the fact is that there is. I mean, there is this mediation, at least according to our data and analysis, and it's a full mediation, meaning that all the increase that the program affects in children in prosocial behavior comes through the path of increased empathy. So that's kind of confirmation of a hypothesis on which also the program works. But the picture gets more interesting or more, let's say, more complicated when we look at their relationship between empathy and aggression. Interestingly, empathy and aggression are usually thought of as being interlinked very, very closely. So that one thing, empathy, reduces the risk of another thing, aggression. But the research is actually not so firm on these questions. I looked at a couple of meta-analyses that have been done in recent years on these questions, and I'm going to skip this one, but I'm going to show you this one. The research shows that there is some correlation often, but it's pretty weak. The newest study that's been done on this was actually titled "The Surprising Non-Relationship of Empathy and Aggression." So this is pretty provocative finding, actually, and we wanted to find out, this relationship, how does it show up in our own data? And I'm going to show you what we found. First of all, the effect on roots of empathy on aggression is about the same in size as it was on prosocial behavior. It's a 0.3, minus 0.3, minus meaning, of course, it's a negative correlation. And what's different from the mediation with regard to prosocial behavior is that empathy does indeed not fully explain the effect that roots of empathy has on aggressive behavior. So this leaves the question, what else is it? What else could explain that roots of empathy has an effect on aggressive behavior above and beyond the pathway leading through empathy? And there are interesting books on the question of what actually determines aggression beyond empathy. One book that I never get tired of recommending is Steven Pinker's The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he tracks the history of violence over the course of the last 2 millennia. And he has a lot to say about determinants of aggressive behavior. And when we try to find out what else beyond empathy might mediate the relationship of ROE and aggression, we looked also at this book, for example, and determinants of aggression that came up. One is perceived inequality. I think it's been a topic yesterday in one of the discussions, meaning that if you see that you're treated unlike other people in a bad way, in a negative direction, that might make you aggressive. Another thing is being aggressively treated yourself, being victimized. We heard one pathway earlier today, hostile attribution bias, is something that might mediate between being victimized and victimizing others. Still another thing, an interesting topic is self-esteem. Most of research seems to say that low self-esteem promotes aggression. There is one psychologist, Roy Baumeister, who has argued against this for decades, and he's also has pretty good data that shows actually it's high self-esteem that meets with little respect that you get from other people. So it's really the discrepancy between what you think of yourself and what other people think of you. Low cognitive ability has always or repeatedly been found to correlate with aggression. And then bad emotion regulation or high impulsivity or low self-control. These are sometimes treated as synonyms. There are nuances, but they basically mean something very similar. And of course, low empathy. So these were the candidates that we really looked at. And not quite coincidentally, we had measures on all of these in our study because we had thought about this question beforehand, before we did the study. Okay. And what you're seeing here is again, quite a complicated regression table, but I've tried to simplify the information so it was digestible. And what you see is this effective empathy, quite contrary to the meta-analysis of the recent past, was very, or moderately, but surprisingly correlated with aggression. So in our study, we did find a strong link between empathy and aggression. But we also find a link between being bullied, which is something we ask, being victimized, aggressively treated by others. We also found a small to moderate correlation with emotion regulation. What we didn't find is socioeconomic status, interestingly. So it wasn't that children with low, for example, SES, were more aggressive, and we found no relationship whatsoever with cognitive ability. So this gave us a hint about where to look at concerning the mediation of roots of empathy's effects. And the model that, in the end, again, the numbers don't need to concern us. I think the relationships are important. The model that fitted best with the data was one that included emotion regulation. So the causal explanation of this is that in order to translate or transfer your empathy into non-aggressive behavior, you also need to be able to control or regulate your own emotions very well. And I think this fits actually pretty nicely, of course, with theory. What we also found interesting is that we found support for a causal relationship between emotion regulation and empathy. The better you are able to regulate your emotion, for example, when you're distressed, the more you are able to project outward, to orient yourself outward to another person and empathize with that person. And I think an interesting implication could be, how can roots of empathy be made even more focused, without losing its focus on empathy, be more focused also on self-regulation, emotion regulation within the children that participate in the program. Okay. Well, I'm approaching the end of my talk. As I said earlier, we also had a qualitative approach. We did interviews, focus group interviews with children, and that was fun. And they explained to us and also had their hypotheses, how it works, whether it worked. Not everybody agreed, by the way. There were also children who said we were so bad that we were really hopeless. We have one pretty quote by a child that really thought that they were a lost case as a class. But most of them still had very good things to say about roots of empathy. I brought you one quote. For example, when I say something to somebody, then I think sometimes I should perhaps not have said that because it makes you feel sad. It was stupid that I said this. I could have just ignored that situation because it didn't do me any good if I offend somebody else, except that this person feels bad and I actually don't want this to happen either. So these are the kinds of things that the children say when we ask them, what have you actually learned? Or have you learned anything, and what have you learned? And I think this quote quite nicely illustrates a lot of the answers that we got. And there was one answer that stuck with me and that I think fits very nicely with the topic of Brian Goldman's talk yesterday. That child said, "I've become more kind through roots of empathy." Okay, I want to just at the end also say a few words about the team. Of course, I'm just the one who presents this study, but there were a lot of people behind this, collaborators who are not with me. The one, Miriam Stieger, who, is she here? Where is she? There she is. Very important person in this study, not as part of our team, but as the manager of Roots of Empathy Switzerland was Miriam Stieger, who was extremely helpful. But I also want to thank especially my collaborator and doctoral student, Madeleine Stauffer, who might have been here if she had not been on maternity leave. She's actually at the baby stage as a mother right now. Yeah, and thank all of you for your attention.